In June 1989, what began as a dream vacation for a mother and her two teenage daughters ended in unthinkable horror on the waters of Tampa Bay, Florida. Joan Rogers was 36, a farmer's wife from Ohio, taking her girls, 17-year-old Michelle and 14-year-old Christe, on their very first trip to Florida. They were excited, hopeful, and just hours away from a day of sunshine and sightseeing. But when they crossed paths with a man named Oba Chandler, their lives took a dark and irreversible turn. What followed was every traveler's nightmare. A boat ride that became a trap, hands and feet bound with duct tape, mouths sealed shut and concrete blocks tied around their necks, before being thrown alive into the bay. The most chilling part? Chandler wasn't a stranger to violence. He was a career criminal, a drifter with a long history of robberies, assaults and manipulation. For Joan, Michelle and Christe, he wasn't just a man offering directions, he was a predator waiting for his chance. And in the end, it would take years of investigation, a trial that shocked Florida, and nearly 2 decades on death row before Oba Chandler finally faced the ultimate consequence. To understand how one of Florida's most haunting family murders unfolded, and the chilling words Chandler left behind just before the lethal injection, we have to go back to where it all began. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon because this is the kind of case that stays with you long after the screen fades to black. Oba Chandler was born on October 11, 1946, in Cincinnati, Ohio, into a working-class family that would soon be torn apart by tragedy. His childhood was marked by instability, but nothing shaped him more profoundly than the day, at just 10 years old, he discovered his father's lifeless body hanging in the family basement after a suicide. For a child, such a traumatic loss left scars that ran deep, creating a void that Chandler would never learn to fill in healthy ways. Instead of channeling his grief toward healing, he began spiraling into delinquency and rebellion, carving a path that would eventually brand him as one of Florida's most notorious killers. By the time Chandler was 14, his troubled youth had already solidified into a pattern of crime. He started stealing cars, running with older boys in rough neighborhoods, and quickly racked up an astounding record. He was arrested more than 20 times as a juvenile. The police in Cincinnati knew his name well, and with every new encounter with the law, Chandler seemed to grow bolder, as though punishment only hardened him rather than correcting his course. His childhood mischief had escalated into dangerous lawbreaking, and soon he was no longer just a troubled teen. He was a young man developing a taste for control, risk, and criminal domination. As an adult, Chandler's rap sheet only grew thicker and darker, reading like a catalog of escalating offenses. He was charged with burglary, possession of counterfeit money, loitering, kidnapping, and armed robbery. What made him more dangerous than an ordinary career criminal, however, was the disturbing sexual element that crept into his crimes. He wasn't content to just take money or property, he wanted power over people, especially women. In one chilling incident, Chandler was caught peeping through a woman's window, masturbating as he watched her inside her home, violating her privacy in the most invasive way possible. It was a behavior that revealed the twisted fantasies lurking just beneath the surface, fantasies that would later manifest in horrific ways. One of the most harrowing episodes of his early criminal career took place in Florida, where Chandler and an accomplice broke into a couple's home, holding them at gunpoint in what began as a straightforward robbery but soon revealed Chandler's true nature. He ordered his accomplice to tie up the man with speaker wire, rendering him helpless, before dragging the terrified woman into a bedroom. There, he forced her to strip down to her underwear, tied her up, and menaced her with his revolver, cruelly rubbing the barrel across her stomach as a weapon and a tool of intimidation. This wasn't just about money, it was about domination, humiliation, and feeding his own twisted impulses. By the late 1980s, Chandler had drifted south, settling in Florida, a place where the sun and oceanfront homes often hid darker undercurrents. He lived under multiple aliases, presenting himself as a trustworthy handyman, a father, and a neighbor, all while concealing his extensive criminal past. Beneath this mask of normalcy, however, Chandler's predatory instincts were sharpening. He was a man who had learned to adapt, to hide, and to wait for opportunities to strike. His victims would never see him coming. In the quiet farming community of Wilshire, Ohio, Joan Rogers was known as a hardworking wife and mother who had spent most of her 36 years surrounded by cows, fields, and the unchanging rhythm of dairy farm life. Her teenage daughters, Michelle, just 17, and Christe, only 14, were bright, spirited, and eager for adventure beyond the small town where they had grown up. For the Rogers family, their lives had been defined by early mornings on the farm and modest living. But in late May of 1989, Joan made a decision that seemed simple, even exciting. She packed up her two girls and set off on a long drive south, leaving the farm in Ohio behind for a week of sunshine and beaches in Florida. It was the first time they had ever left their home state, their first real vacation, and for Joan, it was a chance to give her daughters a memory of freedom and joy before Michelle prepared to start college and Christe entered the whirlwind of her later teenage years. On May 26, 1989, the three of them left Wilshire with nothing but optimism, road maps, and the kind of wide-eyed excitement that only comes from experiencing something for the very first time. They toured Orlando, took in the sights, and soaked up the summer atmosphere. But fate intervened on June 1, when Joan, likely tired from the long days of driving, became lost while navigating the highways around Tampa on their way back north. Instead of heading straight for Ohio, she decided they would spend one more day in Florida, turning the mistake into a bonus stop. This seemingly harmless decision would prove fatal. That afternoon, Joan checked herself and her daughters into the Days Inn on Route 60, a budget hotel overlooking Tampa Bay. Photographs later recovered from a roll of film in their camera told a haunting story in snapshots. Michelle sitting cross-legged on the hotel room floor, Christe smiling in the sun, and finally, a view from the balcony at sunset, the last picture ever taken of the Rogers family alive. It was during this detour that Joan made a fateful encounter. While asking for directions to reach their hotel, she crossed paths with Oba Chandler, who noticed the Ohio license plates on their car and used his own Ohio roots as a way to gain their trust. Charming on the surface, Chandler seemed helpful, friendly, even trustworthy. He not only provided directions but also wrote them out carefully on a Days Inn pamphlet. More chillingly, he offered to meet them later and take them on a sunset cruise of Tampa Bay. Whether it was his easy smile, his familiar background, or simply their faith in human kindness, Joan and her daughters agreed, never realizing they were walking directly into the hands of a predator. On the evening of June 1, around 7:30 p.m., the Rogers family was last seen having dinner at the hotel restaurant. Witnesses remember them as cheerful and relaxed, unaware of the danger that was waiting for them outside those walls. By 8:30 p.m., investigators believe they had boarded Chandler's boat at a dock near the Courtney Campbell Causeway, the same highway that stretched past their hotel. The picturesque Florida night sky, the promise of a boat ride, and the kindness of a stranger masked the reality. This was a trap. What happened next is one of the most chilling sequences in Florida's criminal history. Once out on the dark waters of Tampa Bay, Chandler revealed his true nature. Joan, Michelle, and Christe were bound hand and foot, duct tape sealed tightly across their mouths to muffle their screams. Chandler forced ropes around their necks, each tied to a heavy concrete block, a cruel weight designed to drag them to the bottom of the bay. Stripped naked from the waist down, they were humiliated, terrorized, and fully aware of their fate. One by one, the mother and her two daughters were thrown alive into the black waters of Tampa Bay, left to fight against impossible odds as the concrete dragged them under. The autopsies later confirmed the unthinkable truth: they drowned. All three had water in their lungs, which meant they were still alive when Chandler pushed them overboard. Michelle, just 17, fought harder than most. Evidence revealed she managed to free one of her hands from the bindings before she succumbed to the water, a final desperate struggle for survival that adds an unbearable layer of tragedy to the story. For 3 days, the Rogers family's fate remained a mystery. Then, on June 4, 1989, boaters spotted an object floating in the water near the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. It wasn't debris. It was the body of a woman. The Coast Guard responded, and within hours 2 more bodies were recovered, each of them floating face down, partially clothed, ropes still tied around their necks with concrete blocks hanging from the other end. They had bloated from decomposition, and instead of sinking forever as Chandler intended, their bodies rose back to the surface, revealing the horror he had tried to erase. The victims were naked below the waist, suggesting a sexual element to the crime, though the water had destroyed most physical evidence. Their bindings, the concrete blocks, and the duct tape told investigators everything they needed to know. This was no accident, no boating mishap. This was murder, cold and calculated. The Rogers family had come to Florida looking for beaches, sunshine, and adventure. What they found instead was Oba Chandler. And though their killer thought the sea would swallow their voices forever, their bodies spoke volumes, setting in motion one of the most intensive murder investigations Florida had ever seen. When the 3 bodies surfaced in Tampa Bay, investigators knew immediately they were dealing with something far darker than an accidental drowning. The bindings, the duct tape, the concrete blocks, these were deliberate, methodical, and unmistakably the work of a killer. But the question loomed: who was he, and how had he found these 3 women from a small Ohio town? The first significant breakthrough came not from the water but from land. Just days after the discovery of the bodies, police located the Rogers family's Oldsmobile station wagon parked near the very docks of the Courtney Campbell Causeway, the same area where investigators believed they had boarded a stranger's boat. Inside the car were the personal belongings of Joan, Michelle, and Christe: suitcases, clothing, a camera, all the ordinary artifacts of a family vacation cut short. But among the mundane items was something extraordinary: a days in pamphlet with handwritten directions scrawled across the back. It was a clue so ordinary it might have been overlooked, but detectives recognized its importance immediately. Whoever had written those directions had interacted with the Rogers women on the very night they vanished. That handwriting could lead them straight to the killer. The problem? They had no name, no suspect, and no leads. So investigators decided to take a bold and unprecedented step. In a move that stunned the public, police blew up the handwriting sample and plastered it on billboards all over the Tampa Bay area. The message was clear: do you know this handwriting? This could solve a triple murder. For drivers commuting across bridges, for locals shopping in strip malls, the looping scrawl on the billboard wasn't just letters on a page, it was the shadow of a murderer hiding in plain sight. And then, the break they had been waiting for. A neighbor recognized the handwriting and reported it to police, identifying the man behind the scrawl as Oba Chandler. Suddenly, the faceless predator had a name. Chandler, the seemingly ordinary Florida handyman, was thrust into the center of the investigation. But handwriting alone wasn't enough. Detectives needed something stronger, something irrefutable. They dug deeper, combing through every possible connection between Chandler and the Rogers family. That's when they struck gold. Phone records revealed that Chandler's phone had been used to call the Rogers hotel room at the days and around the time they checked in. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the bridge between the innocent Ohio tourists and the Florida predator who had lured them onto his boat. With the bodies recovered, the car found, the pamphlet traced, the handwriting identified, and the phone records tying him directly to his victims, the walls began closing in on Oba Chandler. What had begun as a mystery with 3 faceless victims in the water was now a case with a name, a suspect, and mounting evidence pointing to his guilt. After years of careful investigation and mounting evidence, the net finally closed around Oba Chandler. On September 24, 1992, he was arrested and charged with the murders of Joan Rogers and her 2 daughters, Michelle and Christe. For the small Ohio town they came from, and for the Tampa Bay community still haunted by the brutality of the crime, the arrest marked a turning point. Justice, long delayed, was finally within reach. But as the case moved to trial, the true scope of Chandler's manipulative nature would be laid bare. The trial began in September 1994, and the courtroom quickly became the stage for one of Florida's most watched murder cases of the decade. The evidence against Chandler was overwhelming: the handwriting on the motel pamphlet identified by neighbors as his, the phone records that tied him directly to the Rogers hotel room, and chilling testimony from other women who described similar encounters with him, offers of boat rides that ended in threats and assault. The prosecution painted a portrait of a man who lured unsuspecting women into his world with charm, only to trap them in violence once he had them isolated on the water. When it was Chandler's turn to testify, he took the stand in his own defense, a move that stunned many observers. Calm and collected, he admitted that he had indeed met the Rogers family, that he had given them directions, and that he had spoken with them briefly. But then came the denial. He flatly insisted that he had nothing to do with their murders. According to him, his contact with them was casual, innocent, and entirely unrelated to the deaths that occurred just hours later. He tried to frame himself as helpful, a man with nothing to hide. But the jury didn't buy it. To them, Chandler's denials rang hollow, a desperate attempt to escape accountability. The prosecution's evidence was too strong, the connections too damning, and the brutality of the murders too specific to be explained away. After weighing the testimony, the exhibits, and the sheer weight of the circumstantial case, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. On November 4, 1994, the judge sentenced Oba Chandler to death. The decision echoed through the courtroom as the families of Joan, Michelle, and Christe Rogers wept quietly, knowing that while nothing could bring back their loved ones, the man who had destroyed their lives would pay the ultimate price. For Chandler, who had lived a lifetime of aliases, deceit, and hidden crimes, the mask was finally stripped away. He was no longer a handyman, no longer a neighbor, no longer a stranger offering directions. He was a convicted murderer, condemned to die for one of the most horrifying crimes in Florida's history. After the guilty verdict and death sentence, Oba Chandler was transferred to Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida, a place notorious for housing the state's most dangerous and most hated criminals. For the next 17 years, Chandler lived behind those cold concrete walls, confined to the monotony of a 6 by 9 foot cell, his every move monitored, his every privilege stripped away. Unlike some inmates who cling to family visits or correspondence from the outside world, Chandler existed in near total isolation. His own family cut ties with him, leaving him without letters, without visitors, without the comfort of a familiar face. In the long stretches of silence that defined death row, he became a ghost, surrounded not by loved ones but by the echoes of his crimes. For Chandler, time stretched endlessly, marked only by the mechanical rhythm of prison life. Morning head counts, trays of bland food slid through a slot in the door, the shuffle of guards' boots in the hallway, and the occasional murmur of other condemned men. There were no freedoms, no escapes into distraction, only the heavy weight of knowing he had been sentenced to die. In those 17 years, Chandler pursued every legal avenue available, filing appeal after appeal in the desperate hope of overturning his conviction or reducing his sentence. Each appeal was a gamble on procedure, evidence, or constitutional claims, but one by one the courts denied them. The Florida Supreme Court rejected his arguments. The United States Supreme Court refused to hear his case. Even claims that his trial had been unfair or that his rights had been violated failed to convince any judge to spare him. The justice system had spoken and it would not be swayed. The years on death row wore on, but Chandler never showed public remorse, never offered a confession, never acknowledged the true depth of his crimes. He lived in silence, trapped in a purgatory of his own making, as the families of Joan, Michelle, and Christe Rogers waited for the justice they had been promised. And with every failed appeal, every denied motion, and every passing year, the countdown to his execution ticked louder in the background, until finally, the state of Florida set a date to carry out his sentence. On the morning of November 15, 2011, inside the heavily fortified walls of Florida State Prison, the long countdown to justice finally reached its end as Oba Chandler, now a frail 65-year-old man who had spent nearly 2 decades in the suffocating confines of death row, awoke to face the day of his execution, a day that had been circled in the calendars of the Rogers family for years, a day that carried the unbearable weight of grief but also the promise of closure. In keeping with the tradition afforded to condemned inmates, Chandler was granted the small ritual of choosing his final meal, and his request was tellingly simple: 2 salami sandwiches on white bread slathered with mustard, a peanut butter and grape jelly sandwich also on white bread, of which he could only force himself to eat half, and a glass of iced tea that he left untouched, opting instead for the bitterness of black coffee, perhaps as a last comfort or perhaps as a grim acknowledgement of what lay ahead. As the appointed hour drew near, Chandler was led from his cell to the starkly lit execution chamber, a sterile room dominated by the lethal injection gurney, where the machinery of death waited with silent precision. Unlike many inmates who use their final moments to speak aloud, to beg forgiveness, to lash out, or to make peace with their fate, Chandler chose a different path, offering only a written statement in which he defiantly scrawled the words, "You are killing an innocent man today." It was a final act of denial, an unyielding refusal to admit the horror of what he had done, a message that rang hollow in the presence of overwhelming evidence and the shattered family he had left behind. Among those who watched from behind the thick glass was Hal Rogers, the husband and father who had once lost everything on a sunny Florida vacation, the man who had been forced to bury his wife and 2 teenage daughters because of Oba Chandler's deception and cruelty. For Hal, the moment was not one of celebration but of solemn reckoning, a chance at last to see the man responsible for his family's slaughter held accountable in the most final way possible. As the drugs coursed through Chandler's veins, his body went still, the fight left him, and at precisely 4:25 p.m., the state of Florida pronounced him dead, ending a chapter of terror that had haunted an entire community for more than 2 decades. If this story gripped you, if you believe the voices of victims and their families deserve to be heard, then don't let their memories fade. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more true crime documentaries that uncover the darkest truths and honor those who were silenced. And let us know in the comments below, do you believe justice was truly served in the case of Oba Chandler? Your voice keeps these stories alive.